So let's, next up is Greg.
Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to also thank Mandy Ness for organizing this really interesting panel, and thanks for inviting me. Well, when I saw the topic for this panel, I was actually wondering at first a little bit as which empire are we really talking about? I know that might seem like a strange question, but there had been some debate not too long ago about whether we're talking about just US imperialism or the imperialism of global capitalism. And so I think this is kind of an interesting question. And when thinking about what's happening in Latin America, which is my topic, I see both dynamics actually at work and reactions to both dynamics as well. So this kind of fits in with, I don't know if people are familiar with David Harvey's book on the new imperialism, where he just makes a distinction between the logic of capital and the logic of territory, which is basically the political dynamic of territorial expansion. And he argues that essentially both forces tend to be at work, sometimes one dominating, sometimes the other. So I kind of borrow from that, and I think there's a reason to believe that there's something like this going on. So anyway, going back to Latin America though, I would say that the imperialism in Latin America, without right now specifying exactly what kind it is, and I'll get back to that at the end of my talk, the imperialism in Latin America takes various forms, and I just want to take a brief overview over that before I talk about the reactions to it and the insurgencies against it. I mean, I think most people are probably familiar with them, but I just want to review them. There's the kind that is basically in cooperation with local capitalist classes or the local governments. These tend to be the structural imperialism of foreign direct investments and bond markets, the international financial institutions of World Bank and IMF, then of course the free trade agreements that the United States makes with these countries, many of which are now being done instead of on a regional level, being done one by one with individual countries. And then there's also the war on drugs and the war on terrorism, with which various countries are cooperating with to varying degrees. And then there's another level of imperialism which is directed against the newly more independent-minded countries, that is the ones that have uncooperative governments. And these tend to take various forms as well. Perhaps at the lowest level is the form of democracy promotion, in quotation marks, through the National Endowment for Democracy, which funds opposition movements throughout the region. Then there are just the pure military presence of military bases and military agreements, whether they are with Colombia, for example, or Brazil. And then the reactivation of the Fourth Fleet, which is conducting naval maneuvers throughout the region. And then there's, of course, indirect attempts to overthrow the governments, whether it's by funding, such as in Nicaragua back in the 80s, or through coups, such as against the government of Haiti, or also in Venezuela. And then there's direct military intervention at times on very rare occasions, such as in Panama and in Grenada. Anyway, of course, in Latin America, and just as anywhere else in the world, there's an ongoing struggle between this kind of imperialist activity and the resistance to it. I mean, an ongoing conflict between the resistance and the imperialism. And one can divide the most recent responses in this area, I would say, into three general categories. There's first of all the kind of electoral reactions to this form of imperialism. Secondly, there's social movement reactions, and then there are actual government policies of those governments that have been elected and are trying to steer a more independent and anti-imperialist course. So let me briefly review what's been going on here. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of this might be familiar with most people, but I just want to try to bring us all onto the same page here. So, in terms of the electoral responses, as everybody knows, the first one really, I think, happened with the election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Although at first it looked like he was going to steer a more moderate course, more the way Lula ended up going, President Lula of Brazil, the government became increasingly more radical. And I would say that for this reason, and actually if you look at the different governments that have been elected in Latin America, one tends to, most analysts have tended to divide them into two different categories. the leftist governments into kind of the more radical left and the more moderate left. I would actually divide them into three categories. But also always keeping in mind that each one of them is unique and different and has its own very specific characteristics, of course. But I would put the Venezuelan government now actually in a class of its own, maybe together with Cuba. Not because it's a socialist country, but because it's definitely the most radical of the governments, and I'll explain a little bit later when I get to the policies as to why I would put it into a separate category of its own. Then is another category of governments which were elected in the mid-2000s, basically, which one could classify maybe as a developmentalist social democracies. And into this category I would put Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Argentina, and I'm not sure exactly yet which way El Salvador is going, which looks like it might fit into the next category, which is the third category I would call neoliberal social democracy, which is basically neoliberalism with a human face. And into that category I think that Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Peru, which just last year elected well, nominally leftist president. The exceptions, of course, to these movements in Latin America, these electoral reactions to neoliberalism. I mean, that's how we have to understand them. They're really electoral reactions to neoliberalism which have been imposed throughout Latin America in the 1980s and 1990s via great suffering. So the big exceptions, of course, in the area are Colombia, Chile now, and Mexico. And we can maybe go in later into why these three countries are exceptions. But so this is the level of, these are the kind of the electoral responses. Then, as I said before, there's also governmental policy reactions and to neoliberalism and to imperialism in the region. And let me just go over, there's a difference again between the domestic and the foreign policy reactions on the governmental level. The domestic policies, as I said before, I think we need to, Venezuela falls into a class of its own because it goes much further than the others. All of the governments that I mentioned earlier that fall into this left category have responded by trying to alleviate capitalism to some extent, or neoliberal capitalism, by introducing strong social programs and redistributing wealth. And they've had moderate success, or actually fairly decent success in all of these countries with that, with reducing poverty essentially. I would say across the board, all the left governments in Latin America have had success with that. You can see that if you look at the poverty statistics of the region, which have declined quite dramatically, in many cases by half or more. Some of it might be due to increasing economic growth, but I would say the economic growth, if you just look at Chile, for example, without strong redistribution, would not lead to this extent of poverty reduction. The reason that Venezuela falls into different categories, it's the only country that has really introduced a strong rural and urban land reform. It has also introduced strong supports for cooperatives and worker-managed factories throughout the region. The only other place that has experienced, or not the only other place, but the other place that has a strong movement for worker-managed factories is in Argentina, and they tend to be opposed to the government, actually. Then there's, Venezuela is also one of the few that has engaged in large-scale nationalizations of key industries, such as in oil, electricity, telecommunications, mining, and other areas. And it's also one of the few that has introduced extensive capital controls. So that's why, for these reasons, like I said, Venezuela falls into a category of its own. Where they all follow a similar path, though, in terms of rejecting and opposing imperialism in Latin America, is in the area of foreign policy. They're pretty much on a similar level, not quite, there's really two categories here. First of all, they all are agreeing on that regional integration is the main method for opposing U.S. imperialism. And there have been a tremendous number of developments in this sense. Just recently, a couple months ago, a new regional organization was created, CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which combines, basically represents an alternative to the Organization of American States. It hardly got any news coverage here in the United States. But I think it's a very, very important step forward in terms of the declaration of a new independence of Latin America from the United States. The reason is that all of them are participating, and they've set there a very, actually fairly progressive agenda. Even the conservative states have agreed to things, for example, such as defending the Falkland Islands against the British. And they've had, or saying that it belongs to Argentina. They've all supported, well, almost all countries in the world have basically opposed the U.S. embargo or blockade of Cuba. They have all agreed on that food resources and food sovereignty is an important goal to achieve and shouldn't be left up to market forces. So they've passed a number of things that clearly declare their independence from the United States and the rejection of the U.S. program, which is something that would never have happened in the Organization of American States because of its inclusion of the United States and of Canada. Other projects that they're working on, for example, is also moving away from the dollar as their main currency, introducing a new currency for South America. This is under the umbrella of UNASUR, which is a union of South American countries. So this all 12 South American countries have come together in UNASUR, and they're working towards developing a regional currency. Then they've also working towards developing a Bank of the South, so they don't have to put all their foreign currency reserves in Western or Northern banks. And actually something that's recently come up in the CELAC summit, which will be on the agenda for the first time ever in the Summit of the Americas that's coming up, and that's because of Latin American agreement on this issue, not complete agreement, but at least agreement that this should be a discussion topic, is the decriminalization of drugs in Latin America. So many countries have suffered from this, and they're realizing that the U.S. strategy is basically a strategy of dominance via the war on drugs rather than any help for them. So this is on the level of policy. Then there are, of course, social movements that people have heard about, no doubt, and I can't go through all of them. Every country is, again, unique, and there have been a lot of them in many different kinds of reaction, and I just want to give you a broad overview. Of course, in those countries, for example, where the indigenous population is especially strong, those movements have been the strongest or the most predominant social movements, especially the case in Bolivia and Ecuador, for example, and tend to be mostly against territorial encroachment and destruction of the environment. Then in Venezuela, the biggest movement tends to be against or for better living conditions. These are community groups, urban community groups, because Venezuela is mostly urbanized. That has been the strongest in Venezuela. In Chile recently, the student movement has been very strong, has been making a lot of headlines for better education circumstances and greater equality in general. Then in Argentina it was the unemployed and underemployed. And in Brazil, it tends to be the agricultural workers, the movement with people without land, for land redistribution. So those are just an overview of the kinds of movements that have been going on throughout Latin America, and of course they haven't started recently. Like I said before, they've been going on ever since the beginning of the neoliberal era in the 1980s and 1990s, but have really come to a head, I think, recently. Now, of course, the relationship between the states and the social movements has been varied from country to country. In some cases, there have been outright cooperation. Now, of course, I don't want to present an overly rosy picture again of Venezuela, because there are tensions clearly, but there's been a tremendous amount of cooperation also between the social movements and the government. Sometimes, of course, people accuse the government of trying to co-opt, which is no doubt sometimes the case. But there have been more difficult situations, for example, in Bolivia and in Argentina, where the tension has been growing, actually, between the social movements, and Ecuador, I should mention, between the social movements and the governments, even though these are considered to be progressive governments. So now, just basically to conclude, well, do these insurgencies, and both on the governmental level and a social movement level, represent any real challenge to U.S. imperialism or to the imperialism of global capital? Now I need to get back to this distinction. And I would say that definitely it represents a challenge to U.S. imperialism. Especially, of course, the foreign policies of these governments with the regional integration efforts. What I forgot to mention earlier, also the efforts to create South-South cooperation, now South-South alliances. Now this has been happening mostly through the countries that are represented in ALBA, which are Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and several Caribbean countries. Now, those alliances, I think, have been more problematic because they're at the expense, they might oppose U.S. imperialism, but I think they're at the expense of working people in autocratic regimes, such as in Iran, Syria, China, etc. So I think they're being, I think that's something that hopefully will be reevaluated in the future. But anyway, the only place I think that is really truly challenging the imperialism of global capital, though, it seems to me right now, is going on in Venezuela. I mean, on a governmental level. On a social movement level, it's happening everywhere. One needs to emphasize this, especially because, you know, if you see what the indigenous movements are doing, they're really opposed to transnational corporations taking over their land, and they're also opposed to governments, their local governments, colluding with these transnational corporations in that effort. So I think all of these challenges are signs of hope because they're putting an end to U.S. political imperialism. But I think the next step really is to truly challenge imperialism, the imperialism of global capitalism.